So we are steamrolling, and that is now the appropriate term for what we're doing. Steamrolling through our history of civilization, and we've got as far as kind of recent Western Europe, and we're starting to see some splash over in terms of colonization of the American frontier to the colonists and home to a bunch of folks who were sort of already early to that party. Indigenous peoples. So we were talking when we left off on Tuesday about kind of the 1600s as a time of rapid change, expansion, growth, and for our purposes, elevation of Western civilization, starting to pick up a real head of steam now, getting into the 1700s, and things like the advent of steam power in the 1800s and so on and so forth. Right? So our trajectory as humankind is, in terms of what we're capable of, it's been very flat for a very long time. And then we start mining coal and things pick up. And we start mining liquid fossil fuels and things go into orbit. So the pace of change is about to speed up real hard, and that's going to mean a lot for us in forestry, certainly. So let's talk about kind of the period immediately following where we left off with the Puritans, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, so early to mid 1600s period, where the Caucasian presence in America is like a colony here, and then 500 miles up the coast, another little colony up there. Basically, one village at a time until it starts kind of exponentially growing with on-soil births and continued immigration. So the immigration is going to continue right through to today, and we'll pick it up right here. So in the 1700s now, we're going to get kind of a whiplash effect or a seesaw effect. The pendulum, if we want to use a third metaphor, is going to swing the other way. So Puritanism, which was kind of a reactionary or ultra-conservative form of the Protestant Christian faith, some people aren't really interested in that. They're arriving to this new world for economic opportunity and for political freedom, not so much for religious or spiritual practice freedom. So that's going to mean that away from the watchful eye of the Catholic Church, which is still the 800-pound gorilla, the single largest organization, and organizations like the Anglican Church and stuff like that, we're going to start to see people sort of branching out more and faster because there's an ocean separating these new ideas, these new trends, this new way of living and doing from kind of the old customs. So people are having to kind of invent or reinvent how they see the world, like the fundamental underpinnings of how do we understand and organize our thinking around stuff like the deep, dark, primeval, boreal forest. If you've ever been to northern New England, show of hands, anybody been up that way? Like Massachusetts on north? Okay. It is genuinely, perceptibly darker looking, right? So we have species like black spruce, and we have real kind of thick, tangled in the southern and Atlantic coastal boreal forest, not like a wide open park-like understory, as we see described in historical accounts of settlers kind of peering into the forest, Massachusetts on south. Up north, it is fully closed canopy, it's old growth, and the mid-story and understory are pretty dark and full of branches of fir and spruce, and I guess tamarack is more growing taller, larch is growing taller, but it is measurably dark up there in a way that they're not used to seeing when they step off the boat from England which has been farmed and logged and conquered and conquered and conquered, and oh god, the Vikings are coming and conquering and carrying off everybody and introducing redhead genetics to places like Ireland and so on and so forth. We would say these days that the northern New England boreal forest hits different. Okay? And so we get that sense of Old Scratch, the devil, is up in those woods, running around, making stories like Sleepy Hollow not just like an interesting tale, but it's like that story got some legs and persisted because people are like, yeah, okay, I mean, it's just a tall tale, but, or these days we might say, it's just a tall tale unless,
Yeah.
and it kind of helped capture the spirit of the sensation of living in northern New England. Okay, so forestry and forest ecology has a shaping and identifiable impact on people's lived experience, what it's like to live in what will become the colony of Maine. Okay, so along these lines, there are natural resources for the taking. The British government the monarchy is busy colonizing the Georgia colony for two primary reasons. Kind of the same thinking it colonized Australia with. That is, let's, in Georgia's case, let's shove a whole bunch of prisoners there. Like, if we don't want them causing trouble in England, let's just ship them across an ocean where they're going to have a hard time getting back and causing more trouble for us, and, you know, good luck with that. And also, while we're there, let's log the old-growth live oaks and build the most powerful navy the world has ever seen and conquer huge, unimaginable areas of land and ocean mass by the strength of the British Navy. Okay? So we see this kind of parodied or lampooned in the old Pirates of the Caribbean series, and that was kind of a madcap fantasy adventure, of course, with skeletons and stuff like that. But the idea of the British Navy being kind of everywhere, and Captain Jack Sparrow and the Black Pearl and Davy Jones and all of these having to constantly sort of deal with Admiral so-and-so appearing over the horizon and trying to get broadside with multiple, up to 3 decks of cannon to blast pirates into smithereens. And also for the British government to sponsor a whole bunch of pirates, but we would call them these days private military contractors, or privateers back in that time. They're not pirates. If they're raiding the French, and in particular the Spanish gold galleons, and bringing some of that wealth back to British shores, or just making things harder for their competitors Spain and France and Portugal, then okay, that's a yo-ho-ho, a pirate's life for me, well done. So this is what's happening. Huge amounts of wealth extraction, right? This is nothing to do with sustainable forest or land management at all. It is cut all the biggest timbers, build the biggest ships, conquer even more land, and extract that wealth too. As that wealth flows back to England and France and Spain in the 16 and 1700s, right? It just gets started in the 1500s, or at the very tail end of the 1400s, and it takes kind of that first century to ramp it up, to bring it to a geopolitical, kind of military and industrial and naval standing to where this can be like how countries operate their budget. So we see this really taking shape in the 1600s with colonization, and then in the 1700s with large-scale, concerted and organized and effortful resource extraction. So the land use history of the United States, we're all pretty familiar with that, and we'll go through that in brief detail. But at this time, all that's going somewhere else. And part of that excess wealth or surplus influx of material and gold and wealth leads to the establishment of things like English parks, things that have been around now for a couple of hundred years, and we see them these days as really kind of a naive tourist to the UK or France or Spain going to any of these places, these parks and gardens. You know, they're a couple of hundred years old now. It looks like they've kind of always been there. This is when they showed up. This is when so many more people had the ability to tame a little bit of some little corner of nature and set up a garden, maintain a yard. Before we have things like lawnmowers, think about what that means. You have somebody with a manual weed whacker, right? It's basically a knife with its tip bent 90 degrees, and you just swing it back and forth and you mow grass. And cutting and carving things like topiary, sculpture in the form of a tree. Sort of the Western version of bonsai, but a little bit larger. So these gardens become possible for everybody else for the first time in human history. And it becomes a mark of prestige, right? We're getting this middle class now for the last couple of centuries for the first time in human culture. And the middle class wants to feel like they are living middle class or better. So let's live outwardly and visibly like we have some money to splash around on stuff like paying somebody to mow the grass so I don't have to do it. That stoop labor, that field forestry and landscaping and horticulture. Okay? That rise of secularism also leads to one of our revolutions, the scientific revolution. So we have folks like Galileo, a couple of centuries before, figuring out stuff like a heliocentric model of the Sol system, our solar system. Our star is named Sol. And that doesn't really end well for Galileo. Did anybody know how he ended up?
Is he the one who poisoned himself with hemlock? What was it? Hemlock? Yeah.
Might be thinking of some Greek philosophers. But Galileo has an Italian name, a pretty sick Italian name, right? He's like Cher or Bono or Oprah. Like one name people, pretty famous, right? That's an Italian name. And the Roman Catholic Church is like right next door. And so the prevailing sense of cosmology, the organization of understanding of all of existence, is that God created the earth and set the sun in its firmament moving over the earth. And so Galileo's heliocentric theory at the time, which ended up making a lot of sense of a lot of astrometrics, measurement of stars, their movements and positions and so forth. But the church wasn't having any of it. So they sort of wholesale rejected that and had Galileo put to death, right? A couple of hundred years before the scientific revolution, starting in the 1700s. By the 1700s, we have this renaissance, this rebirth of the arts and sciences in the 1600s, starting in the Mediterranean and sort of propagating north and west throughout Europe. And so we have folks like Isaac Newton coming up with things like calculus, and different folks discovering or building the tool sets that other folks start to use. I mentioned Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who was essentially an optometrist, made eyeglasses for people, right? So this is the first time in history that the substantial chunk of the population with a need for corrective eyewear has a shot at being able to see the world clearly, right? And so helping a whole lot of people see stuff like writing that explains stuff like calculus. You can see how each discovery sort of makes it more possible, more easy, removes some friction for the next stage of discoveries, right? we get microscopes from Anton van Leeuwenhoek, and we start getting a sense of, oh wow, there's this tiny invisible world in every drop of water that's filled with things moving, swimming around. What are those? What happens when we drink those? Interesting. Okay. So we have folks like Joseph Lister supersetting on top of van Leeuwenhoek's discoveries of microbiology and figuring out a germ theory of disease, early epidemiology. So this is a guy who mapped a whole bunch of deaths, just plotted them on a city map of London, and found that a whole bunch of the deaths were clustered in a couple of spots. What was in the middle of each of those clusters? A well. So they empty out those wells and find like dead rats in them, and it's like, oh yeah, this is how people die of cholera. There's something being transferred from the carcass of a rat to people through the water, and you can see germs. Interesting. If we boil this water, then those germs aren't moving around anymore, and if we drink the boiled water, nobody gets cholera. Okay? So, a lot of scientists, or people who would become scientists, are able to survive to adulthood to become scientists for the first time as these things happen. So, if you've ever used Listerine to sterilize the germs in your mouth, that was named for Joseph Lister. Okay? So the scientific revolution is huge. And science brings us, the regular people who are not necessarily all scientists, a whole lot of expanded ability to survive, a whole lot of expanded ability to not spend all of our waking hours doing hard scrabble labor, because science brings us technology, applying scientific discoveries to solving practical problems. And these days we have stuff like microwaves and freeze drying and nitrite preservation, smoking, curing. We have lots and lots of ways to make food safe so that we don't have to constantly be slaving away in the kitchen all the time and, preparing 1 day worth of food all the time, because we have food preservation techniques like refrigeration and removing xylene gas from barrels of apples so that they don't spoil, or other vegetable crops and stuff like that. Okay? So this is when this is happening. All of these things that you and I, we don't really have to think about anymore, right? We're setting ourselves up for things like electric lights. So we don't have to go to sleep really early in the afternoon in the winter in Northern Europe or Northern New England. When I was a grad student at the University of Vermont, it started getting dark at 3:30 p.m. As you get higher latitude, the days shorten more. When I was doing our research project up at Denali National Park in Alaska, we had 23 and a half hours of direct insolation sunlight. And that screwed with our sleep schedules just as much, right? So if we can invent anything that's a little bit less asthma-inducing than candles and fire, and whale oil lanterns, then that's another plus up to human capacity to do things, right? We just flip a light switch, and now we can work into the night on things like homework assignments. We're inventing the next generation of technologies and so on and so forth, obviously. So this is going to be huge for freeing humans up for recreation. And as we're starting to get parks and gardens developing in places like London, where the urban density is so high and the need to heat people's homes with wood and eventually with coal, right? Everybody at that time is installing a coal chute for their basement. So the coal guy comes by with a shovel, gives you some shovelfuls of coal for the next week. Just kind of how the milkman used to deliver fresh milk every day or two, that kind of a thing. You'd sort of hit that like and subscribe button to have some coal to heat your home. Now that coal has sulfur compounds in it. So when you burn the coal, out the chimney you get smoke with sulfur or sulfate, in particular aerosols. Sulfate is an ion taken a chemistry class, you understand that this can accept two positively charged connections to it. The SO4 2- oxidation state ion. So in water solution, that can pick up, for example, 2 protons. We call them hydrogen or hydronium ions. So that gives us H2SO4 in aqueous solution in fog. London is famous for its fog. Does anybody know what H2SO4 is?
Sulfuric acid, okay.
Sulfuric acid. This is what's known as a strong mineral acid instead of a weak organic acid. So if you grabbed a whole bunch of leaves and like partially decomposed litter, duff, off of the forest floor of Thompson Woods and threw it in a blender with some water, you'd get a mildly acidic solution based on humic acids that are produced as those leaves and things break down. Those are mild acids. Sulfuric acid, not a mild acid. This is a mineral acid, like sulfuric acid, nitric acid, things that you can use to etch glass, for example. You can dissolve glass with strong enough acids. Around this time, the old alchemical practice of mixing sulfuric acid with nitric acid and a third one, maybe hydrobromic acid, to make kind of a super acid called aqua regia, which is so strong you can dissolve gold in it. So royal water, aqua regia, has dissolved gold in it. Pretty nasty stuff. This is what people are putting out of every chimney in London. Millions of people, to the point that the acid fog was hurting a lot of people and killing a few people, right? We have acid rain troubles here in the United States, where we used to up until they added to the Clean Air Act in the 70s. But this is when we had the science and the technology to address problems like heating homes regularly and reliably from coal mines and driving a lot of economic activity that way, without the clear understanding of the implications of public health. We get the main effect, heating houses, but we haven't really figured out how to grapple with the side effect. So it's going to be a major theme for the next couple of 100 years over in the US as well. We're getting political revolutions, so right after the American Revolution, to separate from King George, we have the French Revolution, and the French make the American Revolution possible. They don't like the British, they like our way of thinking, but mostly they don't like the British, and so they provide naval blockades that cut off British armies from their British Navy supply and so forth, and eventually George Washington, after a couple of strategically impressive but militarily kind of face-palming winters of struggle, like at Valley Forge, the French enable Washington to cut off the armies, Continental armies, to cut off Cornwallis and force a surrender and the withdrawal of British troops from the colonial mainland. And so right as we are getting organized as a country, the same thing kind of happens to the French, but it's internal this time. And several of the French nobility who were instrumental in the American war effort were actually unable to go home after the American Revolution was done, because the peasants were not real happy with French government excesses and seized power, and we get movies with Hugh Jackman and Les Mis, right? So, the scientific revolution is happening. As the French Revolution, as the American Revolution are happening, as the colonial powers are starting to reach that same kind of dynamic where the Roman Empire eventually collapsed under its own weight. Too much border to patrol and secure. And with this, we're going to get set up for the next century, the 1800s, with the Industrial Revolution and change warfare and everything else. So, the 1700s, we don't have a lot of forest and outdoor recreation beyond that sort of centuries earlier mode of you're mostly with your family. If you're a journeyman, fill in the blank profession, you have a brotherhood, a secret fraternity, the Royal Order of the Stonecutters in The Simpsons or whatever. And maybe the occasional traveling fair. If you've ever read any fairy tales involving a tinker, for example, a toy maker, or the Pied Piper, kind of a wandering musician busking from village to village, right? We had things like traveling carnivals and fairs doing exactly that up until and through the 1700s and through today, right? We have county fairs or traveling fairs that still come through these days. And you can win the really, really cheap, like $1 stuffed animal that falls apart on the way home. These revolutions, though, are busy setting up everything for a seismic shift on the human experience. Okay? So, in the 1700s, these are some of the landmark events with that, like signing the Constitution and then kind of wishing the peasants the best over in France, using a lot of the same language that the French nobles had supported for American colonists in terms of freedom and delivery from tyranny and stuff like that. It's just interesting how it played out. And then we get into the 1800s. We now have an industrial revolution fully underway. We now have secular and religious forces driving society forward and holding society together. We now have major political changes, democracies. Some of the first functional democracies that we've seen, ours is a representative or republic-style democracy here in the United States. But this is kind of the first resurgence of power to the people since some of those idealistic Greek polises or city-states got conquered pretty readily by the Romans. Okay. Now the Romans had a senate, so that was a republic, not a republic democracy. But the Roman Senate was a pretty elite and very small group of people. Okay, and power consolidated further into the Caesars and the Augusti as well. So we don't really consider Rome a democracy in any way. It's not, or it wasn't. Okay? But this idea of American colonies now, kind of stringing together with the 13 original colonies from the old Schoolhouse Rock. Yeah, that was my generation, man. Now we have a federal government that is stupid rich. Like obnoxious new money, social media. I'm an influencer, I create content rich. Like, let's buy millions of acres from France, because France has to turn those colonies into revenue and wealth, and so they'll sell it for a song. So we get the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So in 1803, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, who is an emissary or diplomat to France for a chunk of his later life, and so on and so forth, right? They are still the founding fathers, and so on and so forth. Alexander Hamilton, for those of you who are into musicals, right? This is his jam. He's just about to get shot by Aaron Burr at this point. So the federal government's making it rain, and they gotta turn that around, make those expenditures into revenue, turn a liability, a cost, into a profit center, an asset. So we buy the Louisiana Purchase, which is Louisiana, like all the way up to Canada. Sort of our states right around here. We have some states with French names like Illinois.
The other day I heard that part of why Thomas Jefferson wanted to go west so bad was because he wanted to find like mammoth bones. Is that true?
I have not heard that
Okay.
oddly specific detail, but it makes sense.
It was just, I don't know, I thought it was weird.
People are now finding mammoth bones in places like Siberia, because the permafrost is no perma anymore. Now we call it mud. Anyway, another story for another time. All right, I'll have to look into that. Thomas Jefferson, mammoth bone enthusiast. All right, so on the back window of his, carriage, I assume he had a horse-drawn carriage back in the day. He was at the front end of the Industrial Revolution before we had cars. I bet he had a bone collector vinyl. I'm just kidding. Vinyl wasn't invented for like another 200 years. But anyway, right? Early bone collector, right? Everything has a historical precedent. There is no anything new. And then we buy Florida from Spain. We buy the Pacific Northwest from England. We buy, in the mid-1800s, kind of leading up to the Civil War, we kind of with Spain, it was more of a, no, we're actually not interested in selling you this stuff. And so, like, the American military fought a whole bunch of battles. And the Texas frontier, Texas is a republic, that was a lot of bloodshed, right? So this is the time period of the Alamo, for example. And then in 1867, Seward's Folly, William Seward, Secretary of State at the time, immediately following the Civil War, bought Alaska from Russia to get that power off of this continent, and bought it for like pennies an acre, and everybody's like, this is a frozen wasteland. Little did they know, there were probably a bunch of mammoth bones up there. Anyway, so this is a big deal, right? This sets up the United States, but it's not 50 states yet. We're not coast to coast quite yet. This sets up the United States to approach everything differently. So all of these European powers, they've been settled continuously for thousands of years. There is no unexplored territory anywhere in Europe by this point. Most of Western Asia, so what will become the Russian Federation, is pretty well explored by this point, right? And Southeast Asia certainly has been continuously settled and growing and improving. Their standard of living throughout, except for Genghis Khan, who's murdering everybody and making the rivers flow red. But here we have most of the entire United States in the hands of the government, and it's just paid a whole bunch of millions of dollars. Now, millions of dollars in the early 1800s is a lot more than it is today, right? We have inflation, which pushes down the value of each dollar. So, when they buy the equivalent of billions and billions and billions of dollars of land from the colonizing powers, they have to turn it over to become productive. And so the way that they do that is they give the land away or they sell it for like next to nothing. So for example, just east of us, southeast of us, in central Kentucky, the new, very, very new federal government at the time, like 1779 or whatever it was giving away land grants to Revolutionary War officers. So George Washington was given a bunch of land that is now right around Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. George Washington was a pretty busy guy. I don't think he ever even got there. But on paper, he had this land. Now there's a bunch of people already sort of living there, and it's awkward, and genocide and stuff like that. But the government's approach to turning this from a cost into a benefit is to give away the land, make it productive. Get somebody out there, just give them the land for free. If they farm it,
Yeah.
or if they mine it, or if they improve the semi-arid Southwest by digging systems of canals, then we'll let them have that water for free. We'll let them have that land for free, and in return, they ship their products back out to either coast and feed our growing cities. So this is how Chicago got big. In order to feed Chicagoans, we hunted passenger pigeons until there weren't any more passenger pigeons left. When they were migrating by the billions to the point that they were actually kind of blotting out the sun for days or even weeks at a time during the migration. Pretty wild stuff. Okay? So, major changes. This isn't happening. This can't happen anywhere in Europe. So, French peasants topple the French monarchy and install sort of the modern French government. So I gotta get through Napoleon, and that's awkward. But anyway, but like all that land's already taken. Somebody's already farming all of France and so forth. Here, well, to the white folks at least, it was free land, ish, just for the effort of it. So we have things like land rushers, the Oklahomans being called Sooners because they gather on the state line and they just happen to go in and start staking out land before the actual land grab is officially over. They went a little bit too soon, and so forth. Calling Oklahomans Sooners is like calling Illinoisans Flatlanders. Like it's not a complimentary term. Anyway, Zane.
Technically isn't the state's official nickname either. It's technically not Cedar State. It's not their official nickname. They just use it on
It's not official, but if people recognize it, then it is effectively the state nickname, yeah?
the it's effectively.
That's right. That's right.
Apparently, the official demonym for Indians are Hoosiers. So that's their official demonym. Is a Hoosier.
Oh, I'm sorry, the Sooners were for Oklahoma.
Yeah, yeah, but I was like Indiana also had like
Yes.
they call them Hoosiers, but it's
Yeah.
but they recognize them as their official.
Hoosiers was a good movie. Hoosiers was also the theme of my freshman hall back in, like, the Neolithic. Yeah.
I have a different question. Relating to like the extinction of species because of like our expansion, is there value in trying to revisit like bringing them back, or do you think it would have been like a natural extinction progression anyway? Like the whole like what is it, restoration versus like historical balance versus like preservation?
Yes.
What is there value in things like that? Because I know they were researching like, can we bring woolly mammoths back? It feels like there might be better uses of that technology. But is it even worth it to try and, like how far back historically do you try and restore, I guess?
Depends on who's shelling out the money to do it, right? These are major, major efforts. So, for the recording, if you couldn't hear that, the question was, for things like the woolly mammoth as it's been extincted by North American hunters fairly recently, actually, or like the saber-toothed cat. Saber-toothed cat remains have been found far south as Florida, right? The Ice Age really played with distribution of species here in North America.
Or like even the passenger pigeon?
Or the passenger pigeon.
Yeah.
Or in Australia, species like the thylacine is coming back. Is it worth spending effort and money on bringing back extincted species when they might have just kind of gone extinct anyway? With the end of the Ice Age, does that make the woolly mammoth obsolete? That's an uncomfortable question to answer because as we enter the Anthropocene, that raises the question, are humans now obsoleting ourselves with climate change? But the rationale is that if we can solve bringing back extinct species like the woolly mammoth, then we can also bring back species that are not quite extinct or just barely extinct within the last 150 years, where we have good genetic material to reconstruct each genome and then find an analogous animal to carry the modified embryo to term. So like the northern white rhino, for example, or mountain silverback gorillas in sub-Saharan Africa, or any of those that are under poaching or deforestation pressure, right? We're about to run out of orangutan, and that's because we all like our palm oil, apparently, in places like Malaysia. So if we develop the tools for a mammoth, the tools are the same for things that are definitely not ecologically obsoleted, and so forth. And it's an interesting challenge. So yeah. Let's see. There was a intact baby or like newborn woolly mammoth that was just uncovered with all of its hair and everything in somewhere in Siberia, and that was like 30 or 40,000 years old, just out of the permafrost, and it's in basically perfect condition. If you look at the photos of it in the morgue for the necropsies and stuff like that, it looks like it's just like freshly dead. So you can work with that, you know. For older things where it's just bone material, there's like almost no genetic material in bone. It's mostly mineral. So yeah, that's a really good question. So we'll talk about, we're getting right up to the emergence of preservation and conservation, because at the end of the 1800s, when those concepts were getting described, really for the first time, because America can do things differently, or countries in North America can do things differently than the colonial powers, we weren't able to add the sort of the reconstitution approach. Can we, modify an elephant embryo to bring back a woolly mammoth? That wasn't even science fiction. Science fiction is like really just getting invented pretty much on the latter half of the 1800s, right? So the ability of people to think creatively about technology and stuff like that, we need the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, to provide us those technologies, but also the idea that we can advance using those technologies. And that shows up in the progression of things like science fiction. So when Frankenstein was written by Mary Shelley, this was in the 1800s. A bunch of basically rich people got together for a long weekend, take a ton of drugs, have an open relationship, and write stuff like Frankenstein. Like, that is starting to become a thing now, a possibility for the first time. We get a category for things like science fiction as folks are starting to free up from just having to work continuously and all the time. Okay, so that was a long digression. What was the question? Anyway, so in the 1800s, we have the Civil War, which is the first war fought using what we would consider modern military technologies. The very first bullet-shaped bullet was a French invention by a guy named Minet, and it was a very soft lead, it was a 50-plus caliber round, and I actually have one in my office if you guys want to see after class. My granddad was a Civil War historian, and it was one of the first, the first bullet designed and shaped and using soft lead to expand to create a soft seal in the barrel around it. Rifling is going to come soon after to spin stabilize or gyroscopically stabilize the bullet and make warfare much more lethal at much longer range. So the technology is rapidly advancing, and things like our military tactics, not so much. So we're using 1600s era military tactics to line up a whole bunch of people, shoulder to shoulder, march them to within 100, 200 yards of each other, and stand or kneel and fire and reload, stand and fire. But the new technologies are much more lethal. So we have this crazy death rate that nobody had ever seen before or really anticipated in the Civil War. The North wins the Civil War based on logistical support, infrastructure, the ability to move people and war material, that is, bullets, bandages, and beans, food, quickly from battle to battle across what is still the American frontier in the 1860s. The frontier isn't going to be declared closed or settled, all mapped out and turned into colonies or states, territories, until 1890. So along the way there, the federal government's still giving away land, and in 1853, in what is about to become one of the largest and eventually the most powerful city in the world, we have a huge area set aside as Central Park. And Central Park is designed at that time by a couple of famous landscape architects, one of whom is Frederick Law Olmsted. You may have heard of him in your landscaping class. To be a natural space. It is a designed natural space. That is, it's designed to have stuff like baseball fields and concert grounds and fairgrounds, stuff like that, but also to feel pretty wild in spots. But wild in a designed way, because we're in control of it. It's a park. It's not wilderness. In the 1800s, wilderness is still a pretty scary place for most people, right? Daniel Boone is not too much before 1853. Okay? Davy Crockett is right around 1853. All right? Daniel Boone, King of the Wild Frontier, right? And so forth. So, in addition to giving away land to private citizens, and we'll end with this, the federal government adopts a new technology and pushes it and supports it, and not artificially, but intentionally pumps it up. The steam engine and metallurgy and mining all come together to provide us the iron horse, railroads. It's going to change everything. So, stop right there. See you on Tuesday. Have a good weekend. Avoid any sulfuric acid that you run across.